I'm glad you're here for Theology Thursday. This is a weekly video that I do related to a theological or biblical subject. If you'd like to click one of those buttons, like or subscribe, you can. But anyway, let's talk today about the Exodus. Now, I don't mean the book of Exodus, and I don't want to look at all the plagues on Egypt and everything related to it. I want to look at the Exodus event itself. Technically speaking, if we really think about the Exodus itself, it really starts with them physically leaving Egypt. And you can read about this. The first dozen chapters of the book of Exodus deal with all of this. And then when we get into chapter 14, we read about the crossing of the Red Sea. And that's kind of like the ultimate description of the Exodus, is the crossing of the Red Sea. Oftentimes the idea of leaving Egypt is connected directly with the crossing of the Red Sea. And so this is found in Exodus chapter 14, where they cross through. And then in Exodus chapter 15, they celebrate it with a song. And so I want to talk about that specific event, because that event kind of summarizes or is the kind of like the capstone event for the Exodus. And look, we do the same thing. The game-winning shot. Well, that wasn't the game-winning shot. Every shot contributed to the win. But that shot was like the final, completion of the game. And so that's kind of how the crossing of the Red Sea, it really begins with the birth of Moses and him being raised in Pharaoh's house. And, and then we have in the burning bush and all the plagues and the Passover instituted. All that stuff happens. But really, it's the crossing of the Red Sea that's the game-winning shot, so to speak. And so I want us to consider that. So there's a couple things that I want to look at when we look at Exodus 14 and the crossing of the Red Sea, and just a few things maybe you haven't thought about, and something that's kind of, or at least a couple of things that are kind of cool about it. So in Exodus 14, they're going to cross the Red Sea. You will notice, if you look through your Old Testament, many of you, if you have a modern translation, you'll have like a footnote by the word Red Sea. Not all translations have it, but you'll have a footnote that says Yom Suf, or Sea of Reeds. So this was a big rallying point among liberal theologians and people that wanted to disprove the Bible, that there was no great parting of the Red Sea, but instead it was like a marsh. That's why it's called the Sea of Reeds, and that's what they crossed. And what's humorous about that is that if that's true, then God drowned all the Egyptian chariots and horses in a swamp. So that's not the case. Probably it just had a reedy bank next to it, but it is Yom Suf. They didn't go anywhere really near the Red Sea at all. And so I want to point out probably what we have with Red Sea, and then talk about it a little bit, about what this Yom Suf, this Sea of Reeds, is, and about its significance. So here is you see Egypt on the left of your screen, of course, the Nile River that spreads out into the delta, and then you'll see the two long fingers that come off of the Red Sea. And so right here you'll see what are called the Bitter Lakes. And what's interesting is that, and I'll give you a blow-up of it here, and so you can see it real closely. And so this lake is still in the maps because it was the biggest, but they're actually a series of these type of small lakes, or we call them small, actually they're pretty large, shallow bottom lakes that run between the Gulf and the Mediterranean Sea. So if you'll notice, here we have the Suez Canal, which connects the Gulf of Aqaba, that finger that comes up from the Red Sea, to the Mediterranean Sea. And then here is still the lake. It was incorporated. I mean, if you've already got a large body of water, why not Instead of digging around it, just incorporate it into the Suez Canal. So that's about the only large one of these lakes that still remains. And this is why that's important. All these other lakes were just kind of incorporated into what is now the Suez Canal and really don't exist as lakes so much anymore as they used to. One of those series of shallow bottom lakes probably was the Sea of Reeds that they crossed. Now, this is important that we understand what we're talking about. We talk about a shallow bottom lake means that it's 15 to 20 feet deep, which is more than deep enough to drown all of Pharaoh's horses and chariots without question. If you've ever been to New Orleans, you will have gone around, or if you take the causeway, crossed over Lake Pontchartrain. Lake Pontchartrain is about 35 miles wide, about 20 miles north and south, depending on where you cross. So if you have people that are all walking by foot and you're gathered at the edge of a lake that's 15 miles in each direction to either side and 20 miles to go across, and the lake is 15 to 20 feet deep, and the armies of the enemy are behind you, you're in trouble. You're in serious trouble. And that's where they found themselves in Exodus 14. They're between the sea and Pharaoh's armies. And so God drops down the pillar of cloud to keep them separated. And then now he's going to part this body of water, this Sea of Reeds, and Israel's going to go through. Now, a couple of things to note about what happens. So let's just pick up in Exodus 14, let's pick up verse 15. The Lord said to Moses, "Why do you cry to me? Tell the people of Israel to go forward," like towards the water. "Lift up your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it. The people of Israel may go through the sea on dry ground. And I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they shall go in after them, and I will get glory over Pharaoh and all his host, his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I have gotten glory over Pharaoh's chariots and the horsemen." Okay. And then the angel of the Lord going before them comes and stands in between them. Okay, so now look at verse 21. All right, and this is important because if you've seen the movie The Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston, he holds out his staff and the waters start to boil and then they begin to part and divide in front of the people. And that looks really cool cinematically, but that's not what happened. So notice in verse 23, "Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind." So the wind's actually like blowing towards them if they are looking to the east across this body of water. "Drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided." So it didn't happen in a few minutes. They didn't sit there and watch the water just part out. There's this wind that blows all night and it parts the waters. Now I know there are all kinds of nut jobs that go to try to figure out some way that this happened with a natural explanation and not by miracle. And the reality is there are some miraculous elements here and some natural elements. God could have just parted the waters and that was the end of it. But he used nature, used the strong east wind to make it happen. That wind also would have dried out the bottom of the ground between the walls of water. And so the Bible says numerous places they walk between water on the left hand and the right, this wall of water on either side. And so God caused a strong east wind to divide the waters, and they're dry so that Israel's able to go across. Now, here's one of the things that is miraculous. Ground that's been underwater, when you remove the water, is muddy. Given enough time, it dries. It doesn't start dry and then become muddy. But that's what happens here. It starts dry, so Israel's going to go across on dry land. And numerous times it says this dry ground, like in verse 22. Again, it says they go over on dry ground. The waters will wall them right and their left. And the Egyptians pursued and went after them in the midst of Pharaoh's warriors. And in the morning, watched the Lord in the pillar of fire cloud, looked on them and threw them in a panic, clogging their chariot wheels so they drove heavily. Oh, I thought the ground was dry. So it was dry for Israel to go through. Then it went back to muddy. So this is miraculous, that it goes from dry to muddy, not the other way around, which is being normal. And so the mud clogs up their chariot wheels and they're not able to go. And so then they say, "Let us flee." And then the Lord said, "Stretch out your hand." The water would come back, and the water comes back quickly. So all night to divide the water by a strong east wind and dry out the ground. Then Israel goes through. Then when the Egyptians pursue, God turns it back into muddy ground so that their chariot wheels get clogged up and stuck. And then the water returns, and that's the end of Pharaoh's armies there in Yom Suf in the Sea of Reeds. And so this is the great event. And it's interesting when you read in chapter 15, they don't celebrate the dry ground that much. They don't celebrate the parting of the waters that much. They celebrate the defeat of the Egyptians, the defeat of the enemies. The horse and rider have been overthrown by God. And of course, people that have been slaves to the Egyptians for hundreds of years, of course they're thrilled that the enemy has been defeated and will no longer pursue them. Because the Egyptians could have, since they were on chariots, gone all the way around Yom Suf, all the way around the Sea of Reeds, and caught Israel, because they got women and children and animals, and they're not moving very fast. They're all moving by foot. Pharaoh's armies could have easily caught them in just a couple of days by taking the longer route around the body of water. But God does this, as he said, to put an end to the Egyptians attacking them and harassing them, and to bring glory to his name. So God brings them out. But now that we've crossed the Red Sea, we got to get somewhere. We have to go to Mount Sinai. So here is where they're headed. This is probably Mount Sinai. It's called Jebel Musa. It's in the Sinai Peninsula. And so there is a monastery these days at the bottom called St. Catherine's Monastery. And so somewhere up there, Moses, probably not very high on the mountain, saw a bush that was burning but was not consumed. This is the traditional spot. There's a little chapel where Moses met God. Of course, this was done thousands of years later. But somewhere up in here, Moses met with God and was given the 10 Commandments. And here you can see this large plain at the base. There's now a highway, but a large area that Israel would have been able to camp in. So this is where Israel would have been encamped. So down there, they would have made the golden calf while Moses was up on the mountain. But most of us want to talk about the Exodus, because the Exodus encompasses all of this, leaving Egypt, getting into the Promised Land. I mean, it takes a long time for the whole Exodus experience. But really, the game-winning shot for the whole thing is the crossing of the Red Sea, or Yom Suf, the Sea of Reeds. And so I just want to talk about that for a moment, because it's pretty cool what God does. And it's memorialized throughout the Old Testament. It's mentioned numerous times that this kind of symbolizes, in this one event, everything that happened with the Exodus, including the call of Moses, the plagues on Egypt, the institution of Passover, the giving of manna in the wilderness, the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai. All of those things are all a part of the Exodus. But the game-winning shot is the crossing of the Red Sea. That would put an end to the pursuit of the Egyptians and kind of puts a ribbon, so to speak, on their getting out of Egypt in this great and mighty and miraculous and powerful act of God of parting the waters, drying the ground, then turning it back to muddy, and then returning the waters to end the Egyptians. So as you reflect on this over the next couple of days, just be reminded of the power and the might of Almighty God to part the sea and to deliver his people from their enemies. God bless you.